Hi there, I'm Matt Donnelly from RotoBaller, and let's talk about those must-start players and must-sit players at the wide receiver position heading into week number 5. I may not be Jamar Chase per se, but I'm always open to talk about my weekly must-start and must-sit players. But before I do, I have a couple public service announcements to make. First, remember, there's still plenty that is going to take place between Monday when I'm recording this video and Sunday when things start to kick off. So be sure to get into the RotoBaller Discord channel where experts are there to answer all your starts and sit questions throughout the week. Second, we're also at the point of the season where bye weeks begin to matter. This is where your drafting came in, people. This is what we prepared for all off season long. We got 4 teams on bye, and they include the Cleveland Browns, the Los Angeles Chargers, the Seattle Seahawks, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That means we have lost the fantasy production of Keenan Allen, Joshua Palmer, Amari Cooper, Elijah Moore, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Now, among the receivers that you may also need to replace this week, T. Higgins, who suffered a rib injury. He wants to play through it, but you know what? I don't know if that even actually helps fantasy managers. We also saw Alec Pierce of the Colts. He left early, as well as Devontae Adams and Deebo Samuel, who are among the elite receivers that you need to monitor, who also were dealing with their own injuries, but still managed to play. Well, kind of. And I'm looking at you, Deebo Samuel. Kind of play. Now, you are starting Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson. These two are above everybody else, and it's not even close. You're also starting Amon-Ra St. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Stephon Diggs, A.J. Brown, and Puka Nacua in your weekly lineups, regardless of the matchups. I mean, the rookie is literally outpacing record-setting performances from Calvin Johnson and Cooper Kupp. So we have some other wide receivers that you can trust this week, and we have some wide receivers that you should be fading. Don't worry, I got you covered. Just tune in. Let's start with those must-start wide receivers, and let's talk about a Baltimore Ravens wide receiver in Zay Flowers, who is taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers. Zay Flowers had a tough matchup against the Browns last week, and Flowers, he did manage a modest 56 yards on 3 receptions. Not exactly screaming must-start. However, the Pittsburgh Steelers are a more than favorable matchup this week after watching Nico Collins of the Texans tear apart this secondary to the tune of 168 yards and 2 touchdowns. This coming a week after Devontae Adams of the Raiders went up for over 170 yards himself. So I suppose that the law of averages here would suggest that Flowers is poised for, 150 yards and a touchdown. Pittsburgh has allowed the 4th most fantasy points to receivers this season, allowing 46.8 per game, thanks in part to those 866 yards and 6 touchdowns that they have given up in 4 games. Speaking of Pittsburgh Steelers, let's talk about one of their wide receivers that you could probably trust this week, and it is George Pickens versus that very same Baltimore Ravens team. While the Ravens haven't yielded the same kind of yardage that the Steelers have, they've definitely been able to pass on this secondary. Currently, Baltimore has allowed 65 receptions, which is among the top 5 most receptions given up in the league to date. Pickens is the very definition of a boom-bust play with his route win rate there on deep balls and contested catch rate. When you have those intangibles, there's always a threat for a big week, especially when you're facing a team that is allowing you to catch the ball. Another wide receiver that I'm starting this week is Michael Pittman versus the Tennessee Titans. I know I always recommend sitting running backs when they face the Titans, and I know I also start wide receivers when they face this same Titans team. Tennessee, they have allowed 824 yards to receivers this season and 4 touchdowns thus far, which works out to about 43.98 fantasy points per game. Pittman, he is needing this game desperately. He is looking to rebound after posting just a single reception for 15 yards against the Rams last week. With the Titans shutting down Zach Moss and this Colts run game, the Colts, they are going to need to throw in order to win. And finally, I'm going a little bit deeper here on another must-start, and that's Rashee Rice versus Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings are allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to receivers this season and have seen opposing pass catchers come down with 74 balls for 882 yards and 5 scores. Rice has been begging for a breakout performance after coming up just short of the goal line twice a couple weeks ago, then hauling in 3 passes for 32 yards last week. If you are looking for that one receiver to basically come out of nowhere to challenge potentially for a top 12 fantasy week, that is going to be Rashee Rice this week as he faces off against this Vikings team. Opportunities, they're going to be plentiful, and this is about as good of a matchup as you can ask for. Now, speaking of matchups that are not as favorable, let's talk about those players that you're sitting, and that includes Deebo Samuel versus the Dallas Cowboys. You broke me last week. You made me look a fool. Samuel, I don't even know if you can even call him a decoy out there against the Arizona Cardinals. Now, I will never forget getting done dirty like Samuel got me last week. So I assume that since he was out there, silly me, that he was going to have some kind of fantasy value. Apparently, that was a lie. This week, a slightly healthier Samuel faces the Dallas Cowboys defense that has been attacked in the air in recent weeks after the loss of Trevon Diggs, while averaging 23.25 fantasy points against, which is actually second fewest. So there's a little bit of a give and take here. Now, if the 49ers are going to put up fantasy production this week, it's going to go to my guy, Brandon Ayuk, simply because Deebo Samuel, he already pissed me off. Now, number 2 wide receiver that I'm sitting this week, it's Calvin Ridley versus the Buffalo Bills. Now, the Achilles injury suffered to Tre'Davious White puts Ridley in a better position. But if it weren't for that touchdown grab last week in London, well, he'd be looking at 3 very poor fantasy showings in consecutive weeks. Then again, you know what? I'm not even going to talk about my aunt. Perhaps Ridley also gains a bit of an advantage as the Jaguars once again are calling London home this week as they wait for the Bills to be part of the NFL's International Series. And finally, Nico Collins finds himself on my must-sit list this week against the Atlanta Falcons. This one, it hurts. I mean, this one cuts deep. Anyone who follows my work knows that Nico Collins is one of my guys. Collins was the overall wide receiver of 3 last week after popping off for over 35 fantasy points against the Steelers. That said, the Falcons, they ain't the Steelers. I'm telling you this right now. They are among the elite fantasy defenses when it comes to defending opposing wide receivers, allowing under 28 fantasy points per game. That's right, they're allowing less to all the receivers they're facing than what the Steelers gave up to Nico Collins last week. When looking a little bit deeper, it's easy to see why. AJ Terrell, he has been balling out. One of the main reasons why the Falcons have only allowed 4 touchdowns in as many games and conceded 459 yards to receivers. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but this kind of feels like a Tank Dell kind of week, doesn't it? So once again, your wide receiver starts and sits for week number 5. Fire up Zay Flowers. A flower by any other name would smell just as sweet when facing the Steelers secondary. George Pickens versus the Ravens secondary. Say nevermore when it comes to defending Pickens. Michael Pittman is looking for that Big Sean bounce back this week as the Colts will need to pass in order to defeat a tough Titans run defense. Rice, baby. If you're looking for a breakout, then the Vikings are likely your best opportunity to do so. Sit Deebo Samuel. I won't get fooled again. Banged up last week, being nothing more than a decoy, and I expect much the same this week. Calvin Ridley has struggled to live up to the hype. Take away that touchdown last week, and you're looking at 3 subpar performances in a row. Nico Collins, I can love you like that, just not this week against a tough Falcons secondary that simply doesn't give it up to opposing wide receivers. Now be sure to give up those subscribes and those likes to our RotoBaller YouTube channel for plenty more great fantasy football analysis.